Hello and welcome to all of you who have decided to join me for this spring's core conversation on Pat Barker's novel, The Silence of the Girls. I'm excited for us to discuss not only one of the most timeless and challenging works on the Lit Hum syllabus, Homer's Iliad, but also a contemporary novel that addresses the Iliad's most glaring gaps and omissions on questions of gender, class, and freedom. I've been teaching Lit Hum since 2016, first as a doctoral candidate in Columbia's English department, and now as a lecturer. I primarily study contemporary literature by women outside of the Western world through a decolonial feminist lens. I've taught courses on gender and sexuality studies, human rights in world literature and visual culture, and the emerging genre of post-colonial horror. Barker is actually a British novelist who was born in a dilapidated, working-class town in northern England in 1943. War stamped her biography from the beginning. Her mother conceived her while serving in the Women's Royal Naval Service during World War II, and Barker never met her father. While her earlier novels fit the bill for traditionally feminist fare, her most revered books, including The Ghost Road, which won the prestigious Man Booker Prize in 1995, are about the horrors of war. In fact, Barker was inspired to write The Silence of the Girls after reading Achilles in Vietnam, a study of combat trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and identity formation by the psychologist Jonathan Shea. Barker published her novel in 2018 when she was 75 years old. On the surface, my scholarly expertise admittedly has little to do with the Lit Hum syllabus. I've always found that being a non-specialist allows me to share in my students' senses of discovery, awe, and sometimes even bewilderment as we approach these transformative texts together with new eyes. I hope to bring the same sense of intellectual adventurousness and community to all of you through this conversation. I first came across Barker's novel while researching options for my students' fall final projects. The assignment asked students to create or analyze an adaptation of a text from antiquity in order to understand why modern writers revive myths to confront some of the most urgent questions of our time. Every year, it's a turning point where students realize they don't have to uncritically accept the canon as the final word on what kinds of lives deserve to be honored with the eternal life of literature. Instead, they can intervene. They can challenge dehumanizing representations, authentically engage with our text provocations, and reclaim power for their own experiences and historically silenced voices. Barker essentially undertook the same intellectual experiment to write The Silence of the Girls. She spotlights not only sexually enslaved women in the Iliad, but also common soldiers, the working class people whose fates depend on the whims of temperamental leaders. The Silence of the Girls reframes the trials of the Iliad from the perspective of Briseis, the captive woman whom Agamemnon and Achilles fight over at the start of Homer's epic. To jog your memory, Agamemnon and Achilles initially possess their own war prizes, whose names are Chryseis and Briseis. Their names derive directly from their fathers' names. The overlap suggests that women aren't perceived as unique people so much as depersonalized extensions of patriarchal authority in the Iliad. Additionally, these women's identities are nondescript and practically interchangeable. They even rhyme. Thus, it is perhaps not at all surprising that when Chryseis' father, a priest, comes to reclaim his daughter with the sanction of the gods, and Agamemnon is left womanless, Agamemnon commands Achilles to hand over Briseis as an easy replacement. The indignation fuels Achilles with so much rage that he recuses himself from the war. The consequences are devastating for everyone involved. Briseis, for her part, speaks exactly once in the Iliad, on the occasion of Patroclus' tragic death. I actually just had to catch myself from saying that Briseis causes Agamemnon's and Achilles' fateful meltdown, as so many synopses online will tell you. Briseis doesn't cause anything. A cause is active. An effect is passive. As a stolen, unspeaking slave, Briseis couldn't be more passive. Formerly, she was the queen of Lyrnessus. Now she is bereaved not only of her crown, but also all her male family members, thanks to Achilles' success with raising her city. In Achilles' eyes, Briseis is merely a living trophy to his prowess on the battlefield, and a pawn for vaunting his superiority above men like Agamemnon. Indeed, it could be said that the only cause for Agamemnon and Achilles' falling out is their own egotistical priorities. Both leaders place their needs for recognition above the well-being of the men they lead and the greater cause to win the war. This is the kind of radical shift in perspective that Barker's novel will command you to make at every turn. It represents the first of 3 challenges I would like you to keep at the forefront of your mind while reading. This first challenge asks, can we separate Achilles, the hero, from Achilles, the rapist and slave master? The Iliad frames the power struggle between Achilles and Agamemnon as an objective offense to Achilles' honor, and his ownership of Briseis as his natural right. Preservation and respect for the whole social order are at stake in their feud. However, in The Silence of the Girls, the social order itself is exposed and indefensible. The kleos, or glory, that Achilles seeks is not a highly virtuous achievement so much as a rat race perpetuating slavery and demagoguery as social norms. The classicist Emily Katz-Anhalt backs up Barker's critique in her book, which is called Embattled: How Ancient Greek Myths Empower Us to Resist Tyranny. Anhalt argues that, quote, the opening scenes in the Iliad begin to suggest that the central problem is not simply Agamemnon or Achilles as individuals, but a hierarchical value system that pits powerful, ambitious men in competition against one another, each pursuing his own interests at the expense of, rather than for the benefit of, everyone else in the community, end quote. In the scene of Barker's novel where Achilles argues with Nestor about handing over Briseis, Achilles objectifies her as the quote-unquote man's prize of honor, an it instead of a her. In reply, Briseis thinks to herself, quote, honor, courage, loyalty, reputation, all those big words being bandied about, but for me there was only one word, one very small word, it. It doesn't belong to him. He hasn't earned it, end quote. The crisis therefore escalating the war is not just Achilles' surprising insecurity or Agamemnon's immaturity. Their dishonorable competition to earn the right to dehumanize a woman provides the foundation for Western literature as we know it. Like the Iliad, Barker's novel begins in media res, which is to say in the middle of the action. But in this case, we meet Briseis before the Iliad starts. She's in her final hours as a queen. She witnesses the mass murder of her family and the fall of her kingdom before being enslaved to Achilles as his concubine. The novel consists of 3 parts. Part 1 establishes a new hierarchy of heroes and villains in the Iliad. From the outset, Briseis rejects Achilles' typical epithets of great, brilliant, shining, and godlike. Instead, she simply states, we called him the butcher. Her deadpan finality scatters all the glitter associated with Achilles' most flattering honorifics to expose the dirtier roots of his so-called talents, his precision and inhuman tolerance for slaughter. In part 1, Briseis learns how to survive as Achilles' quote, bed girl, which she dryly recognizes herself as, quote, by far the most flattering name for what I was. Plague breaks out among the Achaeans. Briseis tentatively befriends Patroclus, who remains the true hero, but even Patroclus cannot help her escape Agamemnon's tyranny. Part 2 inserts Achilles' point of view, and readers gain more insight into the toxic grievances that instigate his ruthlessness. His mother's love is capricious, his codependency on Patroclus is unhealthy, and he's also obsessed with death. Part 3 alternates more consistently between Briseis' and Achilles' points of view after Patroclus dies. Out of a nagging sense of moral obligation to Patroclus, Achilles finally shows some mercy to the Priams and Briseis of the world, though rape remains a norm of her existence. The second challenge of reading this novel concerns the preponderance of graphic violence. Not unlike the countless gruesome death scenes that viscerally capture bloodshed in the Iliad, Barker does not flinch from depicting rape in all of its brutality. I don't think she's trying to convert us from being fans of these war heroes to becoming skeptics or apologists instead. I also think it would be reductive to dismiss her difficult, nuanced portrayals of men and women's relationships with themselves and each other as misandrist or politically motivated. The normality of rape in Briseis' time is certainly one of the most bracing tropes in Barker's novel, but it's not the only violence to contend with. The body horror of plague and butchery of combat receive equally grisly depictions in Barker's pages. Instead of persuading us to hate our heroes, I think Barker is pressing us to sit with their complexity. At the same time, she pushes us to gain consciousness of a reality that the post-colonial theorist Aimé Césaire first observed about perpetrators of colonialism, of which Achilles is one. I find Césaire's comments on the long-tail effects of modern genocides, like the Holocaust, eerily resonant with Barker's portrayals of embattled perpetrators like Achilles. I quote Césaire at some length when he writes, quote, "I think that these heads of men, these collections of ears, these burned houses, these Gothic invasions, this steaming blood, these cities that evaporate at the edge of the sword, are not to be so easily disposed of. They prove that colonization dehumanizes even the most civilized man, that colonial activity, colonial enterprise, colonial conquest, which is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt, inevitably tends to change him who undertakes it. That the colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. Achilles is in some ways the archetype for the quote-unquote most civilized man that Césaire mentions. It follows that even demigods can dehumanize themselves through the violence they commit. Barker herself has similarly observed, quote, "Among the victims of the patriarchy, the vast majority are men," end quote. Colonialism and the patriarchy are both systems for organizing societies that value hierarchy, exclusion, and inequality above inclusion, abundance, and the decentralization of authority. Put together, Césaire's and Barker's comments show how perpetuating such oppressive systems not only undermines the greater good, but also corrupts men who are complicit in maintaining them. The merciless social realism of Barker's novel is undoubtedly disturbing for many readers, and I would recommend taking a break if the material feels too sensitive or overwhelming at turns. But if you find yourself putting down the book because it offends your sensibilities, because these depictions of sexual violence are, indeed, obscene and profane, I would encourage you to keep reading. Think of it as a metacognitive challenge or a test of empathy. Rape is intrinsically obscene and profane. The freedom to turn a blind eye to that reality is often a mark of privilege. The privilege of ignorance, of never having been personally affected by such a soul-destroying event. In interviews, Barker has stated that, quote, "The truth of the body is for me the most important route into the historical past, and into the mythic past as well." She feels this way because the experience of living in a body, of suffering its injuries and its appetites, fundamentally has not changed in 3,000 years. Moreover, as Barker has also noted, quote, "There are reasons to suppose that rape was always distressing throughout the history of the human race," end quote. This supposition may seem painfully obvious, but then consider how routinely male raiders from antiquity portrayed adolescent girls as willingly sleeping with men who kidnapped them, murdered their families, and pillaged their homes. It's also important not to forget that Barker herself is a woman, likely to be disturbed by such realistic depictions of sexual violence. If she's willing to imperil her own state of mind to bear witness to Briseis' story, then there must be a reason for it. It's a reason we should honor, and one we'll discover together. The final challenge I'll bring to your attention concerns the power of myth to reframe contemporary life. The present feels palpable throughout Barker's novel, largely due to the recognizability of enduring power dynamics and her strategic use of anachronisms. As I mentioned in my welcome letter, it's objectively anachronistic to bring the discourse of human rights to bear on an ancient text. And yet, the use of rape on a mass scale as a war strategy is a crime against humanity that exists to this day. Perhaps by pointing out these through lines, Barker isn't superimposing a modern concept on a mythical context. Instead, she's challenging us to see how myth denaturalizes violence. I think she's pushing us to see how achieving full humanity is still a work in progress for marginalized subjects, like women, descendants of slavery, and the global working class. These are just some of the questions I'm excited to discuss with you. I look forward to reading your posts. I encourage you to post your own unique insights, not just reactions to my discussion questions. Each week, I'll also provide you with passages from the Iliad that Barker uses for source material, so that you can grapple with her writing agenda in more meaningful ways. Indeed, I encourage you to think of yourselves as writers. Consider which myths and histories you'd retell to make better sense of life as you know it. I'll be referencing Richmond Lattimore's translation of the Iliad, the one traditionally assigned on the Lit Hum syllabus. However, if you develop an interest in differences between gendered perspectives, I'd encourage you to check out the new translation that came out last year by Emily Wilson, the first woman to translate the Iliad in full. Her perspective shifts some truths taken for granted in earlier translations. Finally, if you end up appreciating The Silence of the Girls, then you can go on to read its sequel. The Women of Troy takes its inspiration from Euripides' play, The Trojan Women. Thank you for joining me for today's lecture, and I look forward to meeting you virtually in the coming weeks.